gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today I'm going to be reviewing Stilicho, Last of the Romans, designed by Robert DeLeskie and published by Hollandspiele. Stilicho, Last of the Romans is a successor to Wars of Marcus Aurelius, which is also designed by Robert DeLeskie and published by Hollandspiele. In Wars of Marcus Aurelius, you were Marcus Aurelius trying to beat back Germanic tribes during the Marcomannic Wars. In this one, this is set in much later Rome. You are Stilicho, who is a really talented half-barbarian general who served the Emperor Honorius and did everything that he could to hold the Western Roman Empire together in the face of numerous invasions. Unfortunately, the historical Stilicho died by about turn 3 in this game, so good luck. There's only one way to win this game, and that is to get all 3 of your enemies surrendered to you at the same time by turn 10. So you have 3 enemies in this game. You have the Goths, you have the Vandals, and then you have the usurper Constantine III, who thinks that he should be emperor instead of Honorius, and you do not agree. And all 3 of these enemies are going to be advancing along their pathways, causing unrest and revolt throughout the area and challenging you in other ways. So to win, you have to get them all to surrender. But there are so many ways to lose. One of the main ways that I end up losing is execution. So while you're doing all of this work, there's a politician named Olympius who's at Rome just dripping poison in the emperor's ear about you. And every time you mess up, he accelerates. His job is to get you executed, and he is very effective at his job over time. You do have your friend Symmachus here at Rome to help you, but you have to take actions to use him and to help de-escalate Olympius, which means that this guy just wastes your time while also threatening your life. Another simple way to lose is to be usurped. So our buddy Constantine III is going to be trying to make his way down here to Ravenna. If he takes over Ravenna, he has gone from usurper to actual person who took over, and that's not so great for you. So you will lose the game if that should occur. The Goths are headed towards Rome, which of course ticks Olympius off, but the Vandals, I mean, what are they doing? They're just heading over this way? Aha! What they're actually doing is they're spreading unrest and eventually revolt throughout the provinces. So you can also lose this game as a result of anarchy. It is possible the entire Western Empire can go into revolt and cause you to lose the game that way. And if it's not your enemies causing problems for you throughout the provinces, sometimes it's your own army. You can also lose by mutiny. So sometimes your army will mutiny at you, and then it's pretty much game over at that point, because how do you command an army that doesn't trust you? And on top of that, it is possible simply to run out of time, because if you do manage to survive the turn 10, but you just haven't finished the job yet, you retire in disgrace. Although that's still better than getting your head cut off, I suppose. So you know the stakes of this game. How does it work? The structure of this game is actually very, very simple. Except for the first turn, you're going to have a deployment phase where you get to move your armies and leaders around, take people out of the recovery box. And basically, this is a very simple army system where you have a leader. So you can't see it super great. Let me move these guys down. You have basically 3 color boxes. One for Constantine III, the Vandals, the Goths. And you're going to deploy leaders to those boxes, and also some of your comitatenses, who are your soldiers. The comitatenses also flip over and can be used as garrisons. Garrisons are kind of like speed bumps that keep the enemy from going all the way into your territory before you have time to do anything about it. For example, because we don't want Ravenna to be taken over by Constantine III at any time, you might want to just always leave a garrison there. Just a thought. And this is actually the setup that's recommended for your very first game in the actual rule book for Stilicho. Most of your conflicts are going to be decided by a die roll, and basically you get to roll a d6 for you, a d6 for the enemy, and then you're going to modify it based on numbers. So all these counters will have numbers on them. Some of these areas have defensive modifiers on them, so it's especially difficult to defeat an enemy in their home space, which is why you have to do that in order to get them to surrender. But the Goths have +7 there, which is no joke. You also have some modifiers that come from your leader, who has a number. Each of your comitatenses is going to boost you by 1, and then there are going to be cards that come into the game that help you boost yourself even further. So sometimes your odds are pretty long, but there are things you can do about it. So after you deploy each turn, your enemy actually gets to go before you, and turns take place in 3 rounds. So in round 1, the enemy draws 3 cards and you get 5. It's like the nice, rich part of the year. In round 2, enemies get 3, you get 3. And then in round 3, the enemies get 3 cards. Ooh, and you get only 1. And after that, you do clean up and start again. So basically, you are dealing with dwindling resources that come off of your deck, while your enemies remain static and nasty. So among the enemy cards, there are basically cards that activate your enemies, and there are events. So if we draw this card, oh, it's Court Intrigues. So that would mean that Olympius goes up 1. We already have our enemies emboldened. They started that way. It's possible to make them feel a little bit more demoralized at various points in the game. And then we're gonna roll a die to see where there's going to be a mutiny, which absolutely stinks. So roll a die, it's a 3. So now the Goths are in mutiny. There's a counter for that. And what absolutely stinks about that is that I had put Stilicho here in hopes of doing a huge run against the Goths and maybe driving them way, way back. And now my tempo is all messed up because of this. When you pull an enemy card, you place it here. This one is going to be an activation card. So since Constantine can't attack, we'll just remove it for this time. And he'll go on what's called the surge track. So I'll mark that that's what went down. So nothing happened with him. But no luck this time. So there's symbols on the cards that are going to tell you what your enemy is going to do. Sometimes they reshuffle the deck, sometimes they just advance, sometimes they embolden. But in this case, our pal Constantine is going to move forward. And what's actually interesting about this, and that was our 3rd card. So what's actually interesting about this is that in this game, you can actually have enemies that fight each other. So these guys would resolve a battle and potentially knock one or the other of them back. So this track is particularly fascinating because sometimes your enemies get into conflicts with each other and do some of your work for you. Sometimes they don't, and they just advance along horribly forever, and it's a nightmare. Once the enemies have gone, you get to draw 5 cards the first time. And you have some choices. So basically, all of these cards, just like in Wars of Marcus Aurelius, if you've already played that, can be played for an event, or they can be discarded to take a different kind of action. So I can automatically make the Vandals retreat a space, for example. I can add to my attack value, which is really nice. An action card is one that you just purely discard to take an action. I can make Olympius back up a couple spaces if I decide to spend this card for that, or I can discard it because I just really need to fight a battle. And then Agentes and Rebus lets you remove 2 unrest or revolts. So basically with each of your cards, except for the ones that are just pure action, you have to make choices about whether you're going to use that card to influence the board state somehow, or if you're going to discard it because you really needed to take an action. So as you spend those cards, there are a few things you can spend them on. Probably your most common is just going to be to attack an enemy. So you spend a card to get into a battle. And then you're actually able to spend further cards after you roll in order to modify your die roll, which can either get you to a tie, which forces a reroll, or allows you to just win a battle outright. So basically, if you've got the cards, after you roll the dice, you can cheat a little bit. You're Rome, after all. However, that also spent your cards, and maybe that wasted some resources that you could have used later. Depending on who has surrendered, you can also spend cards to enlist former enemies to help you out. So for example, if you defeat Constantine III and he surrenders, you can actually hire his soldiers later in the game to give a boost to your die stats in a battle. However, that does tick Olympius off, and then he gets the people at Rome upset at you, so you can risk your neck in order to win a battle. You just have to decide, is it worth it? You can also spend a card on your turn to specifically counter Olympius. So if he's getting up a little close to that execution spot and you want to make sure you keep your head on, then maybe you have to spend some of your precious card resources to deal with him when actually you were really hoping that you could get the Vandals to surrender this turn. If you didn't deploy your army the way that you wanted, or you need to make a change, you can also spend cards to transfer a leader or comitatenses. But again, that's expensive in terms of cards, so you have to be sure that you have the cards to move your guys around and also to do the action that you were hoping to complete with those guys that you moved. You can place garrisons. So these garrisons here, you can spend cards to place more. You also can do things with those in the deployment phase, but you just never know when you need to make sure that you're protecting your walled cities. So these are siege spaces. And if you have a garrison, you can force a siege, which just slows the enemy down a bit. You can also take actions to suppress unrest or revolts in the provinces, or to deal with mutinies, which, based on my first enemy card, I would have to do because, well, that's how things went down. And the other thing you can spend cards to do is prevent a surge, which is the last thing that I want to talk about. So you play your enemy cards and they get to hit you once based on this box on the bottom left, but they also, once the surge track fills with 3 cards, can surge. So almost certainly the next enemy's turn, I would get a surge. And when you have a surge, each of the cards that's in your surge boxes activates again. So basically what will happen is that Constantine III will do a whole bunch of stuff if we have a surge right now. And it may be that I really don't want that to happen because I'm trying to hedge my bets somewhere else. If that is the case, I really want to make sure that I maybe put off the surge, do something to kind of keep it back. You can't just spend cards to prevent surges forever, but if you really need to wait, you can spend some of your cards and therefore some of your resources to buy yourself a little time. So most of the actions you can take on your turn are pretty straightforward, but choosing which ones to take at which time is sometimes a really difficult call to make. And that's the fun of the game. It's really, really challenging to decide which of your conflicts is the most important, because you might decide to focus on one thing and then something absolutely blows up on the other side of the map, or Olympius gets all out of control, or maybe you deal with Olympius, but it lets Constantine III get way closer to Ravenna than you wanted, and you end up with this really tense game of competing priorities. And that's my overview of Stilicho, Last of the Romans. So now for some final thoughts. I'll just say outright, I really like Stilicho Last of the Romans. I was already a very big fan of Wars of Marcus Aurelius, and I would say that Stilicho is a bit of an improvement on the system. A lot of the elements of a game I know and love are still there. It uses the same system. So I really like the card play. I thoroughly enjoy getting to decide whether I want to play a card for its event or for an action. I like deciding what action I want to take and just figuring out how to make the most of increasingly limited resources as I go. For me, that is the core of the game and what makes it particularly fun for me compared to other light solitaire war games. I also love that it is enmeshed in history. I really think the later Roman Empire is underappreciated, especially in games. And so having a game about Stilicho is awesome. And getting to think about him and his situation in a Roman Empire that's quite distant from the one that most people think about, especially when they think about Roman games, is delightful. I will say that the history cards aren't quite as funny as the ones in Wars of Marcus Aurelius, but we also just have less of a sense of Stilicho as a person and of his personality compared with someone like Marcus Aurelius, who was an author and whose wife embarrassed him, etc. It's still really interesting to get some perspective on later Rome and to be thinking about the empire in ways that we normally don't. I also think that there have been some improvements to the gameplay that really do make Stilicho just a bit better. It's an improvement on the original system in Wars of Marcus Aurelius, which I already thought was good. I find combat in this game to be very streamlined and simple. I like that, unlike in Wars of Marcus Aurelius, there is no Eastern Front that you have to deal with. You get to pretty much focus on what's on the map, with the exception of dealing with Olympius, who's back in Rome making trouble. There's still plenty of problems to deal with on the map, and I think in some ways it makes the conflicts that you are dealing with seem a little bit more alive, especially because there are points on the map where the enemies can actually run into each other and have their own little mini conflicts, and I think that is really cool. And it also adds a different strategic element to the game because you're thinking, well, do I leave this spot alone hoping that my enemies run into each other there? Can I make it happen? And those little considerations just add to the fun for me. So while I love this game, there are a couple reasons you might think it's not for you. If you just hate resolving things with a die roll, I mean, it is what it is. It's not going to be a great game for you. And the only other quibble that I would have is actually the same one I had with Wars of Marcus Aurelius. I think it's a little bit better this time because the events are so much more unpredictable. But, you do want to knock one of your enemies out as early as possible so that you can focus on the other two. It's very difficult to fight on three fronts with limited troops, and so the desire to hit really hard and heavy at one of the enemies, push them to surrender, and then divide and conquer from there is going to be strong. That said, the likelihood that the game will just let you do that is pretty low, so I wouldn't get my hopes up that every game's going to feel the same because they're all difficult and full of trouble in different ways. Overall, this is a game that I really enjoy. It's absolutely staying in my collection. I want to play it again right now, and I think that if you're looking for a war game to play and you want something light and you want something solitaire, Stilicho Last of the Romans is a great choice. I think it's a great game, and if any of the things that I've said about it sound interesting or compelling to you, you will probably like it. For me, it's an absolute keeper, a 9 out of 10, and it deserves a Dice Tower seal of excellence. Happy gaming.